Good
Um,
evening, everyone. Bonjour, bonsoir à tous et à toutes. Welcome to the third webinar series in our How to Be an Anti-Racist Educator. This one in particular is treating pathways to becoming an anti-racist human, and we are very excited to bring Jean Wan and Marika Kunas to this discussion. On behalf of the OMLTA and the Ministry of Education, we look forward to future work in this area. Marika and Jean, welcome, and please teach us everything you know.
No pressure.
cool.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. So we'll start with some brief introductions, and then we'll recap a little bit from our module. And I mean, there's a lot of people, so hopefully we'll get some pretty good discussion going, but if not, we have some prompts ready to go as well. And we'll share some resources at the end, so that's the outline. So to start, my name is Marika. I am a PhD candidate at York University. My research focuses on race, anti-racism, and French immersion. And I'm also a long-term occasional with the Toronto District School Board. Yeah, that's a little bit about me. Jean?
I'm Jean Wan. I use she, her. I identify, my primary identifiers are settler, Chinese, Canadian. I am a French teacher at an independent school in Midtown Toronto, as well as an instructional coach. And I am also on the board of directors of the OMLTA. And it's been a real joy to do this module with Marika and with OMLTA. Marika, why don't we start off with you? Like, what interested you in doing this module?
So I was very excited when I was told about it by another researcher that I work with. She mentioned my name, I'm very happy, and sent me along to Floor. And so basically what really excited me is, like I said, my research really focuses on, and I'm also a French teacher, but my research focuses on French and anti-racism and race. And I was really trying to think of ways to encourage anti-racist pedagogy because my research is really focusing on the fact that there's a lack of it, particularly in French immersion. So this was a really great opportunity for me to think through even more, because I like to think that I was already doing some anti-racist pedagogy, but it helped me think through my own pedagogy and like, how can I help encourage this in others in ways that are manageable and like, depending on what level people are at, that are approachable. So that's kind of what got me interested and excited in doing this module. And I'll ask the same question to you, Jean.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this on and off, I would say, for a number of years. It really hit its stride in the last few years, and I think I was particularly interested in thinking about my position with my identities in the French language learning classroom, and then almost like triangulating it, which was a part of like which was a part of the framing that I provided it, or that we provide in the module, but like triangulating it between my identity, the subject that I'm teaching, and then the students that I'm interacting with, knowing that the students that I'm interacting with change all the time. And sometimes it causes my head to just spin thinking about all the different identities and learnings and knowledges and assumptions that I'm constantly navigating within myself, within the curriculum, within the community, parents, students, other colleagues, administrators. Like it's a lot to navigate. And so I think I've always been interested in seeing how to find my way around those paths and around those conversations in a subject that I've just been realizing more and more is deeply colonial and carries these colonial and supremacist roots, while also understanding that like I chose to take French all the way through. I went through core French. I never took immersion in my life, but I chose to go all the way up to OAC. Yes, I'm dating myself, but I chose to go all the way up through to OAC. I chose to go to study at a university. I chose to study abroad in France because I loved it. And I still do love it. And that hasn't changed. And so I think there's a large part of it that's just finding path of that path of like understanding what what I am a part of, and then also finding a way to acknowledge it and build knowledge also with my students, amongst my students, but also with them in my classes, with my colleagues as well. And that's part of the reason that when Flor reached out to me to ask me to be one of the educators for this module, I immediately put my hand up and said yes, because finding those pathways and just finding those actionable items and wherever I am in that journey is what really interested me. So it's been a real pleasure. I've learned a lot working with Marika, and then also learning from the other module educators. So yeah, thank you. Marika, at this point, would you be able to recap the principles of anti-racism on which our module is based?
Definitely. It's my little quiz. Let's see if my learning's still there. No, I'm just kidding. So basically, we wanted to rely a lot on the principles from George Day, who's a really big thinker and theorist in anti-racist education. And so these are the main ones, and they kind of are premised on either having to understand and know certain things or having to do and create certain things. So for one, there's the understanding that race itself is a social construction. It's something that is not biologically, genetically speaking, kind of exists. That being said, there are consequences that come from having a certain race, like white privilege or anti-Black racism. So we can't just kind of say, race doesn't matter, because it has a lot of very material and social consequences. We need to understand that within the racial identity, there are other intersecting identities that result in intersecting oppressions, which is often referred to as intersectionality, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. I think most people are familiar with that these days, but that's another kind of, I guess, before its time tenet of anti-racist education. There's the understanding that educational systems have historically oppressed BIPOC. And so for that reason, we need to use education as a way to counter the oppression of BIPOC. So it's not just, we can't just think, oh, we can, education's great. We have to know that historically, and sometimes even presently, it's been used to oppress people, unfortunately. And so we have to actively counter that. We also need to understand that white privilege and white supremacy are basically the foundations, particularly in Canada, of society. And so coming from that perspective, we can understand a lot more of the different relationships and power dynamics that exist in a racist society. Anti-racist education is holistic, meaning that it speaks to the whole person. It's not just academic, but it's spiritual, ecological, all of those things. Holistic. We want to be creating positive relationships between the school, student, and family, and that's really important. And it's not just like school is the teacher teaching a student, but how can we foster community amongst all of us and give students agency and families agency in their learning. And then perhaps the most important distinction for anti-racist education is that it should lead towards societal transformation. And that was kind of part of the goal of this module, is thinking about actions that we can take, which maybe aren't, a new paradigm in the world, but it will at the very least, change society in some way. So those are the overall principles. You want to go to the next one? Is this one me still? No.
Sorry, I was having trouble finding the unmute button. I think what I was actually interested in with going back to the principles of anti-racism, Marika, was actually wondering if there was one that was coming to the forefront for you right now.
I think for me, this is something that's always the most stand out, and it's the one that I find the hardest with, the struggle, is that societal transformation piece. And I always feel like I struggle with am I doing enough? Is this actually doing anything? Because I think something that a lot of anti-racist activists and educators say, which is true, you don't always have to do the biggest thing. Small steps are important, but that I'm always kind of grappling with, is this too small? Do I need to aim bigger? So I think that's always on my mind, because I think generally for me, a lot of these other elements of anti-racist pedagogy have always been part of how I approach teaching.
Mhm.
However, societal transformation, particularly in terms of anti-racism, is less so. So I think that's something that stands out a lot to me.
For sure. Yeah. I think for me, the one that is standing out is, and that was sort of like that real, the linchpin of my understanding was understanding not just white privilege, but white supremacy as a concept. Um, I couldn't find, I forgot to, my apologies, I forgot to put the slide in. So I don't know, can you all see the diagram?
Kind of.
All right, kind of. Anyway, so the basis of this diagram is based on research by Claudia Jean Kim back in the 90s, who is a researcher in America and who postulated this idea of racial triangulation between white people, Asian people, and Black people. And Kim's when Kim talks about Asian, she's primarily talking about East Asian identities. But in this triangulation, she formulates these three identities primarily in North America along two axes of superiority to inferiority, and then insider versus outsider. And it was mind blowing to me when I first learned about this, because I was able to identify things that I had seen around my life and things that I had experienced myself, in seeing that like white white folks in general, white folks have in their identities carry a place of superiority, as well as like being on the, the most inside of the inside. um Asian people, East Asian people, I'll speak primarily, are often viewed as foreigners, interlopers, the ones who are, or invaders, and taking over people's education and taking the place of other people who are quote unquote more deserving, and yet who are still seen as more superior to Black folks on this continent, but Black folks who are often seen as more insiders, are seen as more in the inside group compared to East Asians. And when I think about that with my own identity, and what I've observed in myself and also what I've learned, I see how it dovetails a lot with the concept of being a model minority, which many of you may have heard of or be familiar with as East Asians. The idea that we feel beholden to not disrespect, to not make waves, to not ask questions or to question, to keep our mouths shut, and to be, exactly as it's titled, the model minorities, the ones who also carry a lot of privilege as people who are often closest in skin color, but also closest in privilege to whiteness. And yet will never be as cool as what it means to be quote unquote Black. I mean, Black exceptionalism also needs to be interrogated, as well as, we learn it as we learn as we learn a lot more in module 4. But there's that idea that while as East Asians, we often subliminally and unconsciously aspire to these aspects of whiteness that we don't even know, in the way that we talk, in the way that in the roles that we hold, and then also in the ways that anti-Black racism comes out in ways that we just don't even see and understand. And so when I think about the pervasiveness of white privilege and white supremacy as one of the bases of anti-racist education, I think about that in my own life, as in my own person, and I think about like how I interact with people around me, how I interact with administrators, how I interact with my white colleagues. I also think about how I grew up as an East Asian person, carrying anti-Black racism and carrying anti-Semitism, and also understanding that these are things that need to be not just unpacked, but undone. And then if I think about all of that going within myself, and if I transfer that to the students in my class, like, I can only imagine all of the different threads that are pulling them. And not just East Asian students, South Asian students, Middle Eastern students, Jewish students, Black students, white students, like all over the planet. And so I think this is where it comes back to understand. I think this is where it comes back to understanding that like my relationship to them is important, but also my positionality and how I approach these issues in class are really important, while understanding, and so that's where the positive relationship between the school and students and the family comes in. But while understanding that we are working within systems that are built to oppress and that uphold ideals that we haven't even been named commonly before the last few years. So that was a lot.
No, that was awesome. Thank you. Yeah, it's like I just think it's right on the nail, like the pervasiveness and the not even being aware of so many different things.
For sure.
And someone is just asking if you can write the name of the researcher.
Sure. Maybe at this point, we'll open it up. Maybe we can leave it on the slide. We'll open it up and see if anyone has anything that they wanted to share. You can one of the prompts can just be if there's one of these principles of anti-racism that's resonating for you, if there's anything in what we said that's resonating for you that you'd like to respond to, or if you would just like to share something, we'll open it up.
Diana.
Thank you, Marika and Jean, for sharing so many different ways to approach anti-racist education. It's a lot to absorb, but I'm finding it very, very helpful. Something that struck me is what Jean has said in terms of the I think it was the racial triangulation. And East Asians in this specific example, proximity or desire for proximity to whiteness. I'm wondering, I too work at an independent school setting, and there was a few years ago an article in Maclean's speaking about how East Asian students in particular are taking up university spaces or spots offered for other students. And I'm wondering if, in an attempt by all people, including East Asians, to play the game to get into university, get high marks, work really hard, do really well in academics. What sort of message is that sending when one group has said, we've set these rules in order for you to be close to supremacy, but now that you are starting to attain it in droves, we need to move the line or move the bar because too many of you are attaining it and taking away opportunities from us. Sorry, that was a very rambling thought, but there you go.
No, for sure. And I think the question of like the us that you just mentioned is also it needs to be dissected, because when they say like when we hear you're taking spots away from us, it's interesting because I've heard the same things, but from my East Asian former classmates who see their rightful spots, their merit-based spots being taken up in universities by folks who they think are not as deserving, or as by folks who have been underprivileged in many ways, or who entered due to basically due to the color of their skin as well. So yeah, I think there's a lot to dissect about like where you see yourself in relationship to power. And I think there's also a lot as an East Asian person to dissect in and to acknowledge in how in my responsibility I carry a lot of institutional and like intergenerational trauma. My position on this continent also carries a lot of privilege. And so for myself as an East Asian person, that is something that I have to work through and work. Like I have to identify those moments of bias and prejudice within me, and then I have to counter it. and then I have to see how it shows up, and then how it has shown up in the past, and just not do it again. And this is where, like, when I'm working with East Asian students, particularly, um, and then also like students who are multiracial or who are transracially adopted, like there are a lot of intersecting identities that are going on, and so I think it just to George Day's point about holistic education, it's really important to be aware of all of these different threads and all of these different facets so that we can first name it. You can't treat something and you can't approach something until you know what you're dealing with. So you have to be able to name it and identify it and say it out loud, and then you can start to work with it. Marika, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I was just gonna say, well, thank you both for your comments. I think that this desire to be close to whiteness and this unattainability is something that, and it's almost like it shows the power, the maintenance, the need for power, right? Like, oh, if you just act like this, then we'll consider you white. Oh, you did that, okay, so we're going to raise the bar because we want to keep the power. Oh, you did that again, okay, we'll keep raising the bar, and it keeps doing that over and over again. And as Jean was saying, then the people who are being oppressed are still going to do it to the people below them because they want the power too, right? So we have to be finding a way that we're getting rid of these bars and instead bringing us all and working together. And I think that's part of the dangers of white supremacy and like also like neoliberalism, but wanting to buy into it, this idea that, if I just do this, then maybe I'll be the one in this position of power, but it's a trap because it's never true. There's only even maybe 1% or less of the population will actually be able to attain that kind of myth. I think we all need to find ways to not buy into that and to challenge it so that we can be working together for actual like transformation of society. Did anyone else want to weigh in or respond to that or anything else?
Okay, so we can, the discussion's never closed, but we can move on to the next part. As you can see here, this is the sort of cycle of anti-racist pedagogy that we adapted and then used as our framework in our module. We do see this as a cycle because with each stage of new learning that we come across and that we take in and that we apply and adapt, we will discover yet another, and I think we're all here, we all understand, we'll discover a new facet that we hadn't discovered, that we hadn't thought about. We'll discover a new angle or a new perspective. We might even look back and think, oh gosh, 3 years ago I did this activity, I thought it was amazing, and now I look back and I was way off base. And so we're constantly going through this cycle of going from unaware to conscious of oftentimes conscious of our gaps, then being proactive in what we want to do, then being forwardly active, and then like forwardly planning. It just starts all over again. I would say for me, I'm at the point where I'm actually quite okay with this. I find a lot of joy in this, and in knowing that like it's not going to end, but it means there's always learning, and it's ongoing, and I'm always going to be growing. So Marika, what has your journey been like as an anti-racist educator, and where do you see yourself now? Where do you want to be?
I feel like I really resonated with what you were saying about like you look back at something you did 3 years ago that at the time you're like, this is the best thing in the world, like I'm changing everything, this is Nobel Prize, and then you look back at it and you're like, what was I thinking? So I feel like I think there's a lot of pressure when it comes to this kind of journal around anti-racist pedagogy, and did I say journey around anti-racist pedagogy, because you don't want to get it wrong, right? Like it's very impactful, whether that be positive or negative, on students. But that being said, I feel like my journey has been very full of pitfalls and successes, But I feel like if anything, I've learned the most from maybe an activity that wasn't a good idea. And then I thought, actually, you know how I could do this instead? So I feel like there's been a lot of ups and downs in the journey. And there's been a lot of moments, like you're saying, where you're like, oh, I just realized I didn't think about that from that perspective. So yeah, I think that's why we were like, when we originally saw this, it was very much like it was presented by Chand and Coney more as levels. And we were like, I don't know, I think this is something you're always going to go through, because you can't be forwardly active about something if you're unaware of it, right? So I feel like where I would see myself now is at all points in the cycle, at all times, really. I'm constantly like, oh, I didn't think about that. At the same time, whenever I do my planning for teaching, it is very much integrated with the principles of anti-racism long range from the beginning. So in many ways, I'm at all stages all at once, which is maybe not the best answer, but yeah, I think it shows like that's what it is, maybe, to be an anti-racist teacher, is like always working through these at different times forever. I'm seeing your hand, Flora. Did you want to?
Yes, thank you, Marika. So I just wanted to ask, for our professional learning meeting that we had at my school this morning, we talked specifically about like focusing on this part of the series, actually, in terms of teachers, the our own actions and how that's connected to, there was a power triangle: actions, institution, and then ways of thinking. And something that I would say last year, through um, work that I've done, equity, and various things that I've been part of, something that has resonated with me and become part of my vocabulary and my pathway is the learning and unlearning. And so I think often we talk about things that as individuals and as educators, what we need to learn, what we need to do. But for me, I think it definitely has had a really strong impact. And then in the way, and I also communicate as being a kind of part of this series, and then also on the equity committee at my school, the importance of using that vocabulary of learning and unlearning. So I was just wondering if you could both speak to the importance of the two, and if you why you feel it is important as well to use those as we continue to support each other and support other colleagues. And then what does that really mean to unlearn, and what is that referring to?
Excellent question. Thank you. Do you want me to start, Jean, or do you want to start? Okay, so I was actually just reading about unlearning today, so right on that. But there's this, like, I think if we think that we just need to learn, that means that we're still accepting the previous reality that we had. So if I'm thinking, maybe if I had a subconscious, like, sexist views, for instance, and I think, oh, I just need to learn a bit more about women, that doesn't actually challenge anything about my sexist views. I just now have sexist views and I know a little bit more about women. So that unlearning is like an important and essential part, because if you're not unlearning what you've already done, you're not replacing or challenging anything. So I think for me, how I would define unlearning would be, it's not necessarily completely like, you can't delete that knowledge from your head, but it's like putting a new perspective on things, as well as challenging previously conceived notions. So, having a belief that anyone who's not from Canada, it doesn't deserve to have a job here. Like, you'd have to challenge that by thinking, well, what is a criteria that determines who deserves jobs? Why do I think that? Where does that come from? And so I would say it's almost like more work, if anything, to unlearn than it is to learn something, because learning something is like, sure, there's some facts, whatever. But once we have this knowledge in ourselves, it's so hard psychologically, like, to even try and challenge that, because that's not how our brains work. I feel like I've gotten lost now. Did that answer your question? Dean, do you want to pick it up?
No, I think it made perfect sense. I think, like, there are two aspects to the unlearning in anti-racism and anti-oppressive work. One aspect is the pure knowledge. And I like how you phrased it, Marika. It's not about just like undoing your learning. You're replacing it with something, with a different, with not just it's not just another perspective, but it's a new and more anti-oppressive way of looking at things. We all come with baggage, we all come with learning, we all come with our place from third and fourth and fifth classrooms. We think a lot, as you know, as educators, we think a lot about the misconceptions and presumptions and assumptions that students come into the class with. So before we start talking about the water cycle, let's make sure that we know that students know what water is and what a cycle is, etc. And we're all always surprised down the line 5 years later when we realize, oh, a student has gone through all of these years and they still think XYZ. Like we've had that before. So there's the shifting of knowledge, I think, which is part of unlearning and shifting to a new way of thinking. I think the part that is often more difficult is shifting our internal reactions to a situation or to how we respond to something, how we emotionally see something as well. And it's shifting that gut reaction of I'm replying to this tweet. It's shifting that gut reaction when you have an encounter in school that doesn't sit right with you, and learning to and through practice and trial and error and hard work, going from an encounter that probably becomes that could become incendiary and fiery and damaging and very unhelpful to all participants, to one, even if it's just as simple as, and I'm going to use a personal example, just understanding that a response like, I hear what you're saying, I need to sit with this. Can you give me a few days? That's it. And I think it's that, you know, as human beings, we're not perfect and we have a lot that we can learn, but we're also capable of a lot. We're so elastic. I think we're much more elastic than we think we are. And so it's balancing that first, that awareness with new learning and new awareness. How do we enact that in our daily lives that makes our daily lives and our daily interactions as aware, as active, as conscious, and also as kind to the people around us. So I think that's like, those are the two pieces that I see, because like I can do all the book learning that I want, but if it doesn't change how I'm acting with the people around me, then why?
Yeah, and exactly, that's the thing I want to talk about was emotion. Like it's huge. The way that we learn things is highly emotional, whether we realize it or not. And then when we try and unlearn things, it's such an emotional process. And I think a lot of the time that's very overlooked. And people need time to emotionally process what they're learning, especially when people might be in a position of privilege and they're trying to, you know, interrogate past actions or past thoughts, or even just being confronted with something they never knew before. Like that's a very emotional thing. And I think that a lot of the time, people who are like more like activist oriented don't always take that into consideration. So we need to be thinking about like, how can we emotionally engage in unlearning? How can we support people through that? Because a lot of the people want, like I would say, in a way, I think a lot of people are open to learning and unlearning, but it's hard, and we need to find ways to do it that will actually be supportive. Yes, that's a great question, Jean. But I'm sorry, Flora, go ahead first.
No problem. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to highlight what you both said. I thought, oh, amazing. I wish I could have, if I'd had that information. I'm definitely sharing all of this. I mean, I already was, but it definitely highlighting what you both said about the learning and unlearning. Because Marika is really true. I don't know that we emphasize, like I said, I didn't really start thinking about the unlearning part until maybe about 1 or 2 years ago, and just the impact that really has and what that means. And as we support others and their unlearning in our own, and what came to mind as well, and what both of you said, is doing so with compassion and acknowledging that these are individuals, that this is it is very difficult to challenge a way of thinking, challenge at this point too, however many, years that we're in our 20s, 30s, 40s, whatever it is, that many decades of thinking one way and doing things one way and not ever really having an opportunity or even thinking of questioning it, because that's how it's been done in institutions and this and that. And so it really has made me reflect more on showing that compassion as well, and making sure, because I think sometimes I know that I can be I'll get irritated or frustrated if somebody's not seeing this, like, how can you not see it? It's so obvious. But that's part of as you said, having that emotional, and being respectful in that reaction and our compassion towards others and towards ourselves. So thank you so much for answering that.
No problem. Thank you. I was going to add "and to ourselves," so I'm glad you said it. Go ahead, Jean.
Oh, I was just going to say, if anyone wanted to chime in, feel free. Also, hi, Monique.
Hi. I think, and in terms of your video, one of the biggest takeaways from me was um, the need to always continually grow and evolve, and not necessarily, I think sometimes we can get bogged down in the negative. Like, why isn't somebody else, so what floor is, why isn't somebody else doing this? Like, why is it like this? Like, how can you think that way? And one of one of my biggest takeaways from your video was not that in and of itself is very unproductive and really doesn't do your journey justice, right? It's a bit of a detour, and can really take you off the journey that you're on, and thereby helping to support others in their journey, right? Like, you're pouring from an empty cup if you're just always saying, why can't you do this? Why can't you do that? Instead of focusing on what can be done.
Yeah, I think thank you, Monique. I think that's really important. And one of the things that I've realized as well, and that all of us in this work realize, is that we know where we want to be usually. And then, but we just need to chunk the steps for us. It's almost like we need to scaffold the steps for us in small steps to see, okay, what is just the immediate next step that I can take in that direction. And I think we sometimes lose sight of the successes. It's very easy to become discouraged and to get bogged down, and we lose sight of the successes. Small ones are also big ones. Sometimes we think this is just a small step, or this is just a small success that I've had. They're big. We can take that, and I think we can acknowledge that. And then at the same time, to Flora Marika's point about taking care of ourselves, I was thinking about a conversation that I had the other day and realizing that staying preoccupied is not the same thing as rejuvenating. And we have to make sure that we stay rejuvenated. We have to make sure that we find ways to refill our energy and our joy. And sometimes, like, I've made the mistake of thinking that as long as I stay busy, I'm okay. That's what I'm doing. But I also have to be able to read myself so that I can keep going. So the last slide that we put up here, again, open discussion, is, and feel free to chime in as you'd like, is just thinking about what your journey has been. If you would like to share where you are, where you want to be, if you're an educator currently in any capacity, what do your students think of the anti-racism work that you're doing? How meaningful or impactful is it? How would you modify your approach to be more effective? And then if you would like to share any mistakes or growth points that you've experienced over the past in teaching anti-racism or anti-oppression, the floor is open. Go for it. Well, maybe Michael first, please, and then Diana. Thank you.
For Diana, do you want to go first, though? It's okay. You had your hand up first.
Sorry, please go ahead, Michael.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'd like to treat the second section of questions because for me, it always comes back to the students and what they're doing, what are they thinking, what are they taking away from this? So there's a lot of stuff going on in there, but I mean, every day I'm teaching in the senior years, and is it meaningful or impactful for them? Is this something worth pursuing? Is this something that even filters into their lives? I don't know if it's too complex of a topic. I don't know if it's too simplistic sometimes. When you put the lens of language acquisition into it too, there are different things you need to unpack because even the language can be problematic a lot of the times if they don't have access to that vocabulary. But are they involved in the planning process? That's something I would really like to pursue a lot more. And I think that that is very, very valid because I don't know that those opportunities are available to them, especially in the senior years, when they're thinking about post-secondary, when they're thinking about those kinds of things. Do I need to change or modify my approach to be more effective? Yes, every day. That's that's my goal every day. I want to be someone who is going to be more effective in this realm of being an anti-racist human and lifting and making um, systems of oppression known. So, because in the cycle that was on the previous slide, I think that the unaware part was the most, it resonated the most with me because you don't know what you don't know. And as you go through this cycle, you do find there's so much out there that you just are not, it's not in your realm yet. So the deeper that you go into this, the more that you find out that you don't know. And then you have a group of students in front of you that you're hopefully wanting to transmit this knowledge to and make them really question what's happening there. But what do they think of it? I've never explicitly asked that. I've never explicitly said, so now we're doing this. What's your take? They've been doing great so far in kind of unpacking a lot of things. But I think that in my practice, where do I want to be? I want to engage them more in that conversation.
Thank you, Michael. I just popped into the chat a resource that came to mind while you were speaking, Michael, on Decolonizing Education by Marie Batiste. If anyone isn't unfamiliar with it, it's a really, really thought-provoking, amazing, foundational, profound work about deconstructing and the Eurocentric model of education. So thank you. Diana, please.
If anyone else would like to chime in or speak, please go ahead because I've already spoken. Anyone? Okay, I'm really glad, Michael, that you went before me because I had what I thought was a fairly simple question, and your comment about how when students come to us, it's also about language acquisition as an educator as well, helped complexify the question I'm going to ask now. And I'm not expecting an answer, but I'm really curious to see sort of what lies at the intersections between emotion, taking care of ourselves that Marika, you and Marika and Flor mentioned, and sort of chunking or having structures that we have to constantly scaffold that Jean was saying. And then laying on top of all of that is also the fact that when students come to us to acquire a language acquisition itself can be an intensely emotional process, especially if it's, for example, a language that the students may not be very enamored of. They might have convinced themselves they can't do X language. So you have those three layers of emotion, language, and systems or structures that I don't quite know what to do with.
I feel like that's $1 million question. It's definitely a juggling act for sure. I think like the way that I approach it generally is I'll think, how can I work within the system to get across? Usually it's more of an equity-minded lesson than a language one, to be honest. So I'll start, what's my system base? What am I trying to get across to the students? And then from there, how can I integrate language? And it's almost like the last question to me, which maybe it shouldn't be, but I'll be honest. Because then if anything, it's more like language in action than anything. It's not as like, prescriptive grammar learning, etc. But it is very, I don't know, having that emotional piece, I think, is something that I'm still struggling with, and trying to like foster positive associations with French. No matter the program, it seems most students have very negative associations with the language. So that's something that I'm still struggling with, and hopefully getting better over time, but I'm not sure if other people have other thoughts to weigh in there.
One thing I started doing at the end of last year and then moving forward into this year is I did a self-audit of my courses. And I've got this table, very big table, where I've got the essential question for, I'm thinking primarily of FSF3U, but I did this as well for French 8, grade 8 core French. But FSF3U right now is built around sort of like essential questions and themes. So the big scale course question is, que faut-il pour se prospérer dans une communauté? So what is needed in order to thrive in a community? And then it's broken down into 4 sub-themes. So for each of the units, they've got the essential question, the learning goals and success criteria. Then our school uses as a sort of like a basis for an EDI curriculum, the learning for justice, social justice standards. So I've got sort of like what standards I'm really working towards. We're also very UDL focused. So I've got like, I cross-reference that with like moments of UDL, as well as the learning skills and work habits, as well as the Ontario curriculum. And just to make sure that not just that I'm checking off all the boxes, but just to see what it is I'm doing. I've got all of like the textual resources that I'm also using, and having it all laid out helps me to see, okay, this is where I've got strengths in my course, and this is where I've got some big gaping holes that I need to plug right away. And I think where that's been helpful is that it provides the big picture, because I can say, and I've got in my chart linguistically, this is what I want their absolute number 1 takeaway to be. But also thematically, and then from the EDI perspective, this is the number 1 takeaway that I want it to be. If they forget everything else about the subjonctif, but they remember il faut que ça soit équitable, fabulous. I don't care. So like I need to make sure that thematically it matches up linguistically, and like this is their one thing that they're remembering. And I think having that big picture path and big picture goal to follow helps me to, it's not just a backward plan, but understand that things are always going to fall by the wayside and things are always going to be forgotten. But if I just keep hammering home this one thing, this unit, I really trying to hammer home that there's a difference between social identity and social identifiers and personal identity. Because oftentimes I've found that students confuse, like, I'm a Taylor Swift fan, or I'm a hockey player, with I'm a white person, or I'm East Asian as an identifier. And so this unit that we're doing, this is the one thing I want them to understand. And so through it, and again, this is FSF3U, but through it, they're learning in French how to say race, ethnicité, ethnie, classe supérieure, which is apparently how you say it en français for upper class. Like, who knew? and all of that sort of stuff. But like they're gaining the knowledge and not just the vocabulary, but they're gaining the understanding to be able to work within that language. But their big picture is that they can now hopefully we're not done at unit yet, but they will understand the difference between social identifiers and personal identifiers. And so I think having that big picture, this is their one takeaway, helps a lot in anchoring my program in what is necessary and what can be forgotten or let go. So my 2 cents. Anyone else?
I'll chime in just quickly. I wanted to go, also thank you, Jean, that was great. I wanted to just go back to the idea of asking students about the work that we're doing that Michael brought up. And I think it's really important, like, I think it can be very intimidating to get feedback as a teacher, I find still to this day. But something that I do a lot with students is like Google Forms or exit sheets or informal feedback. And I try and do it as anonymously as possible because then they're more honest. But it feels, it's like so essential and it will completely transform the work. And to me, it's also so rooted in anti-racist principles, like that idea of giving them a little bit more agency in what they're learning and what they're taking away. So I just think that's something that I just wanted to say, like, we should definitely encourage that more amongst ourselves, because that's where we can actually see if they're learning anything. Hopefully they're learning what they're liking, what they'd rather be learning about, those kinds of things.
For sure, thank you. I think if no one has anything else that they would like to share, Flor and Michael, shall we end here? I'll take
I
that.
saw a nod.
Okay, I'll take that as a yes. So thank you so much for attending, everyone, and for your contributions and for your active attention and participation and engagement. It was really, really nice to be able to share and to hear and to feel in community with you all. If you haven't been able to watch all of the modules, they are on the OMLTA website and they are open to everyone, free. You don't need to be an OMLTA member. So please spread this amongst your colleagues. And we are going to be wrapping up this module series next week with module 4, is it, Flor? Yeah, so module 4 on Afrocentric education and Black joy. Flor, Michael, did you want to wrap up?
Just a big thank you to both Marika and Jean for their contributions. And if you've already seen the video, you know that this was more interactive, of course, but things come out of natural discussions. So just as Jean said, if you're able to join us next week, that would be fantastic because you will always learn more in a community like this. Thank you so much on behalf of the OMLTA and the Ministry of Education.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. I think we'll stop the recording.
Yes.
Yes.